Alright, so what I've got here is my tie bar end that has the bushings, poly bushings that I've installed. You can see the chassis mount here has elongated over time due to wear. Now what I should do is find a welder, someone who can weld this back into shape. What I've heard as a spec is 70 millimeters is this diameter of this hole. As you can see, mine has been elongated out over time due to wear. So I am not a welder, and I not currently going to find one or go seek out the services of a welder. So what I've decided to do is I built these plates that will go over, and you can't make them very thick because the poly doesn't compress very much. So what I've done is I built them out of this metal that I found at the hardware store. It's just some diamond plate, and I've cut it to fit. It doesn't fit precisely. It can move and slide around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some grease on the inside here and grease on the front face where it contacts the bushing, and then I have one to go on the back as well. So what I'll do is I'll sandwich this chassis mount here between two of these plates, which will prevent the poly bushing from squeezing through this hole, and under pressure it's been squeezing through this elongated hole here as the suspension moves up and down, which is causing the poly bushing to wear out prematurely. So I'm going to go ahead and install these, and since these don't fit, there's some space in, it'll allow the whole system to move around like it should as the suspension goes up and down. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'll put one on the front, one on the back, and then I'll put the poly bushing back on. Okay, so I've got the poly bushing on and the plate on, and basically I'll just push it through here. Now I'll rest that on, and I'll put the back plate on. Again, I'm putting a small amount of grease in between all these parts to prevent any squeaking as much as possible. Put this back plate on. Now the back bushing, which I'm going to utilize my homemade bushings for the rear position. I'm going to test these out incrementally. So I made these homemade bushings, and you can see my DIY on that in a separate video. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to test these out at the back position, which doesn't take as much abuse as the front position. Put some grease on there, and then put this back nut on. Now what I'll do is I'll take my take my wrench, if I can find it. There it is. Take my adjustable wrench and I'll hold on to this back nut, and what I'll do is I'll spin the tie bar to tighten the whole thing down. And I'll do this to get it tight enough so that I can get these holes up here in the front type of the tie bar to line up with the holes in the lower control arm. Okay, what I've done now is taken my jack stand and I've raised up the lower control arm until it's even with the tie bar here, and so I'll continue to tighten down the tie bar nut with my adjustable wrench until the holes line up here in the front end of the tie bar where it meets the lower control arm. Okay, well, it turns out that having any extra thickness behind that front bushing is a no-go. So I can't use this as a temporary fix to plug the hole or make the hole smaller in order to prevent extra wear on the bush. So what I'm going to do is I've got a smaller washer here that'll just fit inside the hole, and what I'm doing is I'm bending it so that it'll be concave, and it'll just kind of sit in the hole and act as like a pivot point, like a knee joint, and allow the bushing to compress enough so that the tie bar can go in, can go rearward enough to line up the front holes. The problem with this was that it was, even though it's pretty thin, it's still too thick. And you really have to crank down the nut to tighten up the whole system a lot in order to compress it. Since they're poly bushings and they don't compress as easily as the rubber, this little bit of thickness prevents the tie bar from moving rearward enough to line up the front holes unless you really crank it down, which I didn't want to do. So what I'm doing is I'm bending a smaller washer that'll just kind of fit in the hole and act as a pivot point, and then that will allow the front bushing to compress enough in order to allow the front holes on the tie bar to line up with the lower control arm. So this is just a setup I made to do that. So I'm just basically got a washer that'll fit perfectly in the hole, two sockets, one just big enough to fit on the outside and one small enough that it fits around the inside of the hole, and I'm pushing them together, squeezing it so that it makes this washer concave. Okay, so there you go. I don't know if you can make it out on the video, but now this washer, it's got a pretty good angle or roundness to it, and now I'm going to throw it behind the front bushing so that it sits inside of the hole in the chassis, the mounting point in the chassis, and it should allow it to pivot but not move outside of that hole. It should keep the bushing centered on the hole. Okay, so I'll show you what I'm talking about here. Let's move this out of the way. So now this washer here will kind of sit in the hole. Doesn't go through, but it allows it to move around and act as a little pivot point. So I'll throw that on. Put a little grease on it. And then throw the whole assembly back into place and put the rear bushings or rear protector plate back on. Okay, what I've done at the back side is I've taken an extra plate. I got one plate here to protect the bushing on the front side, the back bushing on the front side, and then the nut that goes on the back is just big enough. It meets the size of the poly bush, so when the poly bush does compress a little bit, and so it ends up going over the edge of this nut. And when it does that, the nut eats into it. So I've created this piece, which I've made concave to fit inside of that nut, and that will protect the rear bush. There's plenty of extra space on the back here. There's plenty of thread on the back to be able to add some extra bit, because the poly bushes are a lot thinner than the rubber ones. So what I'm going to do is I'll throw this bit on there, and then I'll fit the nut around the back. Okay, when you get it back together, just tighten up the bolt here and nut, and then it's all set. And that's complete reinstall of the lower tie arm after kind of a DIY fix of the rear bush.